Well, welcome to CITRIS and the Bantam Institute, and welcome to our first research exchange of the semester. We're thrilled to have you here and thrilled to have our guest speaker, Jutta Williams, who you're in for a treat. My name is David Lindeman. I direct our health programs here for CITRIS and have the honor of doing both little moderation, introducing our speaker, but also giving you some background. We have a few items to share with you. Those of you who may be new to Berkeley, our incoming class members, this is our 10th year now of hosting these research exchanges and bringing some of the very best innovators from around not only the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, but from around the globe to speak to our colleagues here. Today's talk is not only presented by our CITRIS Health Group, but also in conjunction with our Women in Tech initiative and our Public Policy initiative, all parts of the growing programs here at CITRIS. In CITRIS Health, and we're thrilled because Jutta has a very strong background in that area, we've been working in this space of how to do technology transfer to benefit individuals on everything from person-centered care all the way to large systems care, using all the technology solutions we have available to us, from mobile and cloud to sensors to robotics to, of course, data science. This year, we are working across campuses in a number of ways, and we are bringing together programs such as this, as is CITRIS, across all of our different verticals. For a few things here, we'd like to make sure that you know about some of the forthcoming events, because we have a really engaging fall semester for people who are associated with CITRIS and can come and take advantage of our programs. We're a week from now, on the 18th, we're hosting the minor lecture with our EECS alumna, Dr. Barbara Simons. Her title of her presentation will be, "Can we recover from an attack on our elections?" And that will be sponsored right here in the Banatao Auditorium at noon. On the 19th, we're having a very large program with View from the Top lecture with Tom Siebel, who's founder, chairman, and CEO of C3 Energy, been a great champion for CITRIS and for the campus over the years. And he'll be speaking on digital transformation, survive and thrive in the era of mass extinction. And that again will be at noon on the 19th here in the auditorium. And on the 17th, very pleased, we have a number of collaborators on this. We are hosting with a number of the premier aging research programs and education programs across campus, our UC Berkeley innovation program, the Aging Research and Technology Summit. And this year we're focusing on disrupting neurodegenerative diseases, an all-day program which will be held again next Tuesday, let me not get the wrong date, in the Pauley Ballroom. And if you're interested in attending, we are closing registration today at the end of the day. So please quickly jump on your phones or computers to put that through. And then on September 25th, our next research exchange will continue again, and it'll feature Dr. Jiang Lin, the Nat Simons Presidential Chair in China Energy Policy from LBNL, the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and he'll be discussing his work on remote sensing, water security, and biodiversity. So I'd now like to turn to our guest today. Jutta Williams is Senior Technical Program Manager at Facebook, as you've seen in the promotion. She's had a myriad of engineering background in programs. She's most recently come from Google, where she had similar responsibilities, but she's also been involved on the national and international level on privacy and security, and been on the U.S. Technical Advisor Group for International Standards Organization for AI, machine learning, and deep learning. Prior to her coming to Silicon Valley, she was Chief Compliance and Chief Privacy Officer at Large Integrated Health Systems, which really gives some wonderful input to our health projects, and has been dealing with privacy and security issues in a number of areas. And she's also worked with a number of major tech clients throughout her background, and has been a project manager and leadership capacity in a number of areas around crypto systems, including with the DoD. Jutta graduated with the highest distinction from Carnegie Mellon University, a master's in information security policy and management, and I've had the pleasure of hearing her speak in a number of settings. She's a spectacular speaker, not only on the issues of information and privacy and security and healthcare, but women in tech and the importance of AI standards. So without further ado, let me turn the program over to Jutta. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gosh, that makes me sound, oh, am I on? Can you guys hear me? Good. Makes me sound rather fickle in my career choices. So I have kind of gone where the wind blew. Every time I found something passionate I wanted to work on, I just said yes to the opportunity, and it's surprising where that will take you in your life. So if you take one message away from this today, know that sometimes yes is the right answer, even when it seems like it shouldn't be. So we're going to talk today about something different, though. We're going to talk a little bit about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is privacy and security. As David mentioned, I've worked in this field for almost 20 years, which is a really long time in privacy. I want to tell you a little bit about my evolution of interest in privacy. And it started when I was working on crypto systems for DoD, and we were developing some really cool new privacy enhancing technologies that had real policy ramifications on culture. And so I got very interested in policy at that time. We were working on some interesting questions of civil liberty, how we use information protection technologies, and how do we keep a free society free. Those conversations were led by patriots inside of government and outside. We had really nice and interesting groups of people from all walks of life that came and had those conversations. And as a pretty hardcore security engineer at the time, I was really intrigued by policy and the importance of being able to craft a great narrative around what kinds of technologies we should be building. So for the rest of my career, I really kind of chased that idea. So I went to Carnegie Mellon and I studied specifically this topic. I looked at the economics of privacy and privacy technologies and how commercialization of our personal information kind of grew out of this new economy that we were building at the time. And I'm a lot older than you, so that was back in 2006 when I was in grad school. And so it was a relatively new idea back then. What were we doing with information and how much was it worth and how could we commoditize it in this information age? And then I went to work for, well, I had a startup, but we won't talk about that because that didn't work out so great. But I encourage everybody to give it a shot, and especially here at Berkeley where you have a lot of support for those sorts of initiatives through CITRIS and other organizations. Having the right lawyers and having the right IP people and having good advisors who are going to tell you if your ideas are good or bad, super important. So I did that for a few years and then I went and I earned a paycheck again. I worked for Deloitte and I did consulting projects for really large health systems and finance systems and big tech companies here in Silicon Valley, and mostly on crypto-related technologies, but then later on the development of privacy and security programs because that became a thing. They didn't really exist before then. And then I landed in healthcare, and I have to tell you, it was so humbling. Healthcare is the most interesting of all industries to me, personally. It's an industry that requires information, thrives on information, but does a really poor job of sharing information and transforming information into action. So almost every day that I worked in health, which was almost 10 years, I learned something new about data and how it could be used to save lives, but also about what it means for people when you use their information for things that are confidential. You know, the doctor-patient confidentiality promise is very key and core to medical ethics. And so as we became more electronic, and I worked at a really large health institution called Intermountain Healthcare, and it has a large informatics group, it was really relevant and important for us to talk about why the laws exist, what they provide as far as civil liberties are concerned. There's a reason that healthcare and privacy is enforced out of the Office for Civil Rights. And it was a really great education that really linked my engineering discipline to my understanding of humanity. And that really was exciting to me. So I left data for a while and went and I became a compliance officer. I don't recommend that job to anyone. You're dealing with HR issues a lot. There's a whole lot of, my food arrived cold at my hospital bed. It's a really tough job. And I really kind of lost touch with technology, and that made me sad. So Google had kind of offered me a job a couple times, and I said, great, let's go. And I worked there for almost 2 years, and I was working on their AI division, trying to identify ways to use big data to teach machines how to help us diagnose illness better and to enhance doctors and their judgment so we could provide better outcomes. So I was there for a while, and then Facebook came to me with a really interesting question. And I wrote a LinkedIn article about this because I got so much hate mail from my friends and networking colleagues for going to Facebook. And I said, look, the only way we're going to transform health is if people trust technology to help them with their healthcare practices, their decisions, their choices. And right now there's not enough trust in the internet for us to really make health applications viable. So I went to Facebook to help them with some of the privacy challenges we're facing there, really to help instill and engender trust in the information age again. I think that we've lost a lot of that trust. And that means that people aren't using tools that they could to save themselves and their lives and live healthier. So that's my journey. It was a little bit strange, kind of blew where the wind blew, and I'm proud of it. And who knows what we'll get next. But this is a kind of a synopsis of my learnings across that journey, and I hope you'll find it interesting. But we're going to talk a little bit first and foremost about why I think that control, discipline, and process lends itself to really much better innovation and a lot better adoption of great technology. And this is, again, not something that came intuitive to me as an engineer, because nobody likes to be told what bounds there are for your creativity. Nobody likes being put in a box for creativity. But if we build programs correctly, and if we focus on these tactics and techniques the right way, this is actually quite freeing. And so I'm hoping to share that perspective and maybe get a little bit of feedback on whether you think this is real. But first I want to talk about my first car. I love this car. I saved so long for this car. It was a 1991 Ford Tempo, and it was black, and the interior was red, and sometimes it felt like you were crawling inside of an animal when you got inside because it was just really red. But I loved that car. And when I went off to college the first time, it was 2 weeks before my 18th birthday. My parents had moved to Tulsa, and my dad gave me $300 and said, okay, good luck. And I was driving off to Salt Lake City, Utah, where I went to the University of Utah. Go Utes! Boo! Okay. My first stop leaving the house was to stop by a flower shop and spend 1/2 of my budget on flowers for my mom. Aw, yeah, well, it comes in handy later. So I was traveling to Salt Lake City, and back then gas was only $1.19 a gallon, so I'd kind of done the math, and I knew I was going to make it okay. I only had to stay overnight one place, so I thought I'd have plenty of money. And as I was going through Colorado on this beautiful switchback road, I realized that I was a terrible driver. I think I should have known that when I borrowed my brother's car at 15 and drove in a canal, but I found out that you don't ride your brakes all the way down a mountainside, and that brakes smell really bad when they start to burn. So I learned a lot about braking systems, because at the bottom of that mountain, my brakes weren't working too great, and that meant I still had a couple hundred miles to drive with pretty crappy brakes, and I had no money left because of the flowers for my mom to get my brake pads changed. So brakes became really important, and if you've never driven without brakes, I thought I'd give you a little bit of first-person view. These are 3 different YouTube videos that kind of depict what it looks like when you're driving and your brakes fail. It's kind of scary. I like the one on the bottom best because they knew what they were in for. He got some buddies, and he's going to go out there and stop the car as necessary while he drives home. But there's a common theme in these videos, and I'm curious if you picked up on them. And maybe it would help if I had audio on, because you could really hear the fear. There's a lot of fear involved in driving without brakes. And you might also notice the guy on the top left, he's getting passed a lot. So when you're driving without brakes, you go slow and you're afraid all the time. And that's a really scary thing, especially if you're in an industry where going fast is your lifeblood and you have to innovate and change and go fast. And we don't always know what the landscape looks like. So going slow is a symptom of having poor braking systems. And so I would suggest that there's an alternate way to look at that, which is to say that advanced braking systems help us go fast. And in fact, there's some data to prove that, because I work for data companies. You always have to provide data. This is the average car speed, well, actually the top reported car speed over time. And you can see that as there's innovation in braking technology, it means that we can drive faster. Because we have to stay safe, right? We have to stay in control. We have to be able to stop at signs. We have to be able to make turns gracefully. And so as braking technology innovates and grows and improves, so does our speed. So I think there's some credibility to my premise. So my hypothesis is that better brakes mean we can go faster. And braking systems don't actually box us in, but they actually free us to do more. So when we're in control, we go faster and I think more safely. And if you take a look at some of the greatest, fastest cars on the road, this is the personal point of view for an F1 Formula driver. You can see in the top left corner is kind of what he sees and kind of the cameras outside of the car. And you can see on the main part of the video, you can see how many controls he has at his disposal, that this is high technology. This car was purpose-built for him to go fast. But it's also purpose-built for him to go in a specific way that he was trained to drive. And it was also purpose-built for him to drive on a road that's well-designed, managed, and has marked course markers, right? You can even see in the bottom right corner of his dash that he's drawn a picture of what the actual course looks like. And this is great. I would say that compliance programs, security programs, privacy programs, the sorts of programs that I have administered over my career, in industries that are well understood and well known, we can go really fast. I'd say finance is in that bucket. We've gotten really good at managing finance systems, and we've gotten really good at managing health systems even. Now they're slower for a lot of reasons, but we actually understand that landscape pretty well. But that's not always the case. So I work for a couple of companies now that have been looking at technologies that are not well understood, and it feels a lot different. So this is a rally car driver. If you've never seen a rally car, it's really amazing. These guys go so fast. Take a look at this road. It's not purpose-built for speed. There's no barriers. He's just driving with pure talent at his disposal. And this often feels like what it's like when you're trying to manage risks in really high innovation, intense places. You have incredibly talented people who are really good at steering. They have great technology that was purpose-built to go fast, to go slow, to upshift, downshift, and that technology wasn't necessarily even purpose-built for what you're trying to accomplish either. I mean, GPUs were invented for graphics, not for AI, and yet it works incredibly well for that. But it wasn't the first set of GPU chips that we used for AI that actually worked really well, right? So our technology may not be purpose-driven, or purpose-built rather, and we sometimes make mistakes, right? So if I can point out one difference between these two videos, it's that the top speed on the first video was 278 miles per hour, and the top speed on the second video, as fast as that looks, is only about 135 miles per hour. So when you don't know the landscape, when you don't know where you're going, it's important that you know that you also have to slow down a little bit until you figure out what your landscape looks like and your technology and your systems and your processes are designed specifically for what you're trying to do. So control, if that's what helps us go fast, comes from lots of different sources. First and foremost, we have to listen to our users, who may be consumers or customers. For most of my career, it was patients. We have to listen to them and make them the center of what we build, because they know what they need, and they'll tell you if you listen. Of course, there's privacy and security advocates who speak on behalf of large groups of people, classes of people. You gotta listen to them as well. There are lots of internal and external security experts whose opinion is valuable, right? I listen to lawmakers and regulators quite acutely. I spent a lot of time working with regulators in DC over data health policy. Lots of great understanding and experience in understanding how that data should be leveraged and should protect consumers. Academia and research institutions, of course, are cutting edge, thinking up new ideas. I've got to stay in touch with all of you all. And then for me, one of my favorites was technical standards bodies. So as David mentioned, I used to chair for the US on AI standards and vote on behalf of the US at ISO. And that organization is great because it's about interoperability with the world. So if you ever have a chance to work on one of those committees, I would highly recommend you do. Anybody can. Anybody can be a technical expert, even all of you as students. So we need you. We need you as consumers. We need you as employees. We need you as advocates in industry. And we also recognize that change is incredibly hard, and especially in places of innovation where there's not really clearly defined rules, right? It's mostly opinion. So we have to sift through opinion, we have to apply some judgment, and then apply change. And sustainable change is incredibly hard to maintain. So I don't know how many of you have ever tried to pick up exercise on a January. I've tried it. And I'm pretty good for a week or two. My husband's watching this, he'll attest. I'm really bad at sustaining. So sustaining change is really, really hard. But when it comes to privacy, security, and data protection, there's actually some framework in the US at least for how you create sustainable change. And I like this framework. I've used it in my personal life even. I've used it on most of the programs I've ever developed. And frighteningly, it was written the same year that my tempo was made, 1991, and it's articulated in the federal sentencing guidelines. Anybody know why it would be in the federal sentencing guidelines? Silence. Yes. What was that?
Parole risk?
Parole risk? That's actually not a bad suggestion, and yes, to a degree. This is how you define whether or not you took a rule seriously, and it's part of, you've made a mistake. People make mistakes. Mistakes happen all the time. Even perfect programs make mistakes. But what they want to know is how effectively or how diligently did you try? And so your fine, your penalty, and your sanction is highly dependent on how hard you tried to meet all of the expectations of what is an effective program. And this is true if you're driving a car, and it's true if you're processing health data. If you follow this process, you have a high-level oversight. We have a DMV that issues you a driver's license. We have policies and procedures. We have driving guidelines we have to learn, right? We have open communications like hotlines where you can call and say, I saw a drunk driver. All these ways that you can report that somebody is or isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then you have mandatory training and education. I can't remember what was required for learner's permits here in California, but I think it's pretty extensive. And then you have monitoring. You have police out there watching traffic laws, right? Writing tickets. And if you detect an error, you write a ticket and you make a response. If you find somebody who's a DUI, and you arrest them. And then there's consistent enforcement. And that's what creates sustainable change. And that's why people follow driving laws. And it's no different for data protection. The same exact process applies. So we have high-level oversight. For healthcare, that was the Office for Civil Rights here in the United States. We have DPAs in Europe. We have policies, we have guidelines, we have written guidance that tells us what's expected of us at a minimum bar. We have open communications, reporting hotlines. We have a mandate that every company that processes your data has a hotline you can call if you're concerned. There's mandatory training and education for privacy for most industries that are regulated here in the US and certainly abroad. So I had to take HIPAA training every year and attest that I understood it. And then there's monitoring and auditing expectations. So they tell me that I have to log all of your access to my medical record because I need to know if somebody accessed it inappropriately. And then you have to investigate. If somebody says, I think that my mother-in-law looked at my records, I have to investigate that as a person who manages data in healthcare and in other industries. And again, they have to have a disciplinary process where people are held accountable for their actions. And intention matters, right? Not everybody gets fired for every event where they make a mistake. But certainly, we have to be enforce discipline if somebody has done something that weren't supposed to. And for the government, if you are recklessly in disregard, those sanctions and penalties get really big. As opposed to, hey, I tried really, really hard, and they say, okay, great, I'm glad your program is working great. I had about 120 of those when I was a privacy officer, where they said, hey, this person's complained. We showed them our program. They said, thanks, we appreciate you take this seriously. People make mistakes. We move on. So the other way I'd say that discipline makes us faster is that when we're smarter, we address problems earlier in the development life cycle, right? This is a super well-published cost analysis that NIST did, and it suggests that when you make changes to your product, whether it's a giant engineered product or maybe a paper that you're writing, that the cost for making edits is much, much lower the earlier in your design work. And that if you actually submit your paper to your professor and say, oh my gosh, I made a huge mistake, can I get that back? That's going to cost you 30 times as much as if you made that change while you were still designing your hypothesis. It's the same as true for technology. So if we can build privacy, security, compliance into our product architecture really early in its design phase, it means that you're free for the other 29 times the effort that we would otherwise be spending on remediation. And so it does make us faster as engineers, as UX designers. It certainly makes our customers much happier. And frankly, it just is a real morale boost when you're not always making mistakes you have to go back and fix. And you can't quantify some of those sorts of things. So the next thing I'd say is that when we're disciplined, we make fewer mistakes. This is our goal in life. I'm much more disciplined about specific things as I've gotten older because the costs are much greater. I don't eat as many cupcakes. But this control is only as effective as it is uniformly applied. So when we say that we're going to design a control, let's say access control, and we're going to have two-factor authentication for any access to sensitive information. Oops, sorry, that control has to be applied everywhere or else it's an ineffective control, right? So it's very important that as you design your strategies that you make sure that you can apply them across an entire spectrum of systems, anywhere data travels, whether it's stored, processed, transmitted, maintained. Wherever that data goes, those controls have to be applied fairly uniformly in order for them to be effective. I have a personal adage that says we only measure things that matter. So it costs a lot to measure things. Like, how many of you have to do status reports on certain projects that you do? I do like 50 of them, so maybe this is only relevant to me. But I quantify all these measurements for the progress I'm making on my projects, and I really want to know that somebody cares, right? If I'm going to spend that kind of effort and I'm going to measure something that acutely, then it should be actionable for somebody, and somebody should care that I'm measuring those things. So when we are disciplined, we measure things that matter, and in the intelligence world we had a saying, it said, information that isn't actionable is just news. And I'm tired of collecting news about teams and projects and efforts. I want it to be actionable, I want it to be leverageable, I want it to be useful. And we need to make decisions based on what we measure. And that's another form of discipline as well, is that when we know about something, we take action. I hate this phrase, we only need to get it right once. It's very common in Silicon Valley because entrepreneurs and billionaires only have to get it right once. But this is also a term that applies to adversaries, right? We have to be right 100% of the time in order for us to protect data. But the adversaries only have to be right once. And our data is gone. So this is a double-edged phrase because we work with entrepreneurial groups, we work with innovators, we work with engineers. And this idea that if they put in enough effort, it should be good enough is a really dangerous one in security and privacy. So we have to be disciplined insofar as we have to be right all the time or design controls that can be right all the time. And when we get lax and we do something silly like open up an obvious phishing email and lose 80 million records, then that's clearly a lack of discipline, and they only had to get it right once. And then I want to talk ever so briefly about discipline and enforcement of discipline in public settings. So when I was a compliance officer, we had lots of sanctions. It was a sad truth. We had 23 people fired for Facebook violations in 1 year. Discipline is intended for a couple of purposes, right? One is to teach the person and to provide education. Maybe that's a termination, or maybe that's just re-education. Mm-hmm. But there's an intention to correct an action by a specific person. But there's also an expectation that you're going to correct that this is a deterrence action, that you're going to let other people know that you take this seriously enough that you're going to hold others accountable. So I see some sisters here. Let's say that we punish one sister for doing something inappropriate. Oops. Do we tell the other sister so that they know that that's not something they should be doing? Is it public or is it private? And that's a really hard question. And it's a hard answer, especially when it comes to malfeasance or doing something inappropriate. But we in the industry certainly have all of our evils and all of our sanctions displayed very publicly, and the rationale there is that everyone can learn from everyone else's disciplinary actions. In healthcare, in HIPAA, it's a highly subjective rule. It says you should use reasonable and appropriate controls based on your size and complexity. And that rule applies to a 4-doctor practice the same way that it applies to a very large integrated health delivery network that has billions of dollars to spend. So how do you make a determination that's reasonable and appropriate based on your size and complexity? And this is a topic that I've really struggled with just in the last couple years while I've been working at scales of in the billions of users, is that what seems simple when you're medium-sized or even large becomes highly complex when you're dealing with billions, 10 billion users, right? So reasonable and appropriate based on your size and complexity is a really hard thing to measure. And so the rules don't give you a checklist. They don't say, you must use 2-factor authentication every time that you access sensitive information. You have to determine, as the person accountable for that rule, what your reasonable and appropriate measure is, and then you have to hold yourself accountable to that. And sometimes we get it wrong. So the first time that we heard in healthcare that text messaging between a patient and a doctor was not allowed was because of a sanction that occurred down in Phoenix with a 4-doc practice. And up to that point, most of the industry felt that that was a point-to-point communication over a telephone network, which was allowed. Right? You can call a patient, still a telephony system, so why isn't it allowed as a text message? When was the first time we saw in an enforcement action that the OCR determined that that was actually an email, and that email over an open network was not authorized? So text messages were now no longer, must be encrypted in order for them to be allowed. So it's through the disciplinary actions, it's through the public display of disciplinary actions that we actually get interpretive guidance for what's allowed and not. And so I used to pay very much attention to all of those disciplinary actions, and hopefully if you're in health, you will as well. I am a big firm believer that people are really smart. My husband would disagree sometimes when he's driving on the highway, but I think people are super smart. So most people will buy in when they understand the rationale for something. Right? If it's a real reason, if there's a real reason that we do something, if we brush our teeth every day because we know that we'll get cavities, then we're going to brush our teeth every day. Right? There's a rationale, there's a reason why we do something. And so when we can explain those and we help people understand what's expected of them by answering that question of why, we can have them make micro decisions every day without your guidance, without your support, that all lend themselves to the same level of protection. And this is particularly important in tech, and I think that this idea of boundaries versus barriers is an important one. This is probably the most common conversation I have with engineers building tech for health, is that in the engineering world, we are told, bust through barriers, break through barriers. Barriers are our enemy. We want to overcome barriers. But in some industries, and I'm going to use health as a prime example, these aren't barriers, these are boundaries, and these boundaries should be respected because they protect people in specific ways. So I'll give you an example. I was having a very adamant argument with somebody about whether or not a patient should have the right to delete information from their medical record when we're hosting it on our systems. It's a GDPR right? We should be better than the minimum bar of the law. And we had a really good discussion around privacy rights and the importance of personal choice. And then I also talked about how medical records are used for delivering care in the operational setting. And when somebody comes and says, I want to remove my medical history of Oxycontin prescription from my medical record, there's a potential that that person is a drug seeker and they want to remove notation of having been prescribed that medication because they know that that medical record will be shared widely and other doctors wouldn't issue them that medication. So there are real reasons why this is also a business record, and it protects people and makes them stay healthier. And so we have to be able to understand where there's boundaries and where there's barriers, so that we respect the boundaries to protect people at the same time that we allow for innovation to bust through the barriers that are truly just, they're providing an efficiency in our processes. So I also wanted to emphasize again this idea that scale requires new thinking. I came with quite a degree of hubris, I'm not gonna lie, when I went to Google especially, because they were just entering into this kind of healthcare endeavor. And I really felt like I knew what I was talking about. So I had really clear interpretations of what was right and what was wrong, what was the regulatory interpretation of privacy rules, and I came with quite a lot of upfront guidance on what they can and can't do. And the truth is that when you talk at scale, when you're talking about AI, and you're talking about data, and you're talking about mining data, the old way of thinking at smaller scale will debilitate advancement of technology in these spaces. And we had to think of new ways to approach clinical trial work, to approach data acquisition through IRB approvals and things like that, because our old way of thinking was a dead end for technological advancement. And so I had to check my hubris, I had to check my knowledge, and I had to start asking questions instead of making statements. And so my favorite new thing is always to start with question marks and not necessarily periods at the end of the statements I use. Because things have been tried, and there are really good reasons why things are done the way they are. And it's really important for us to understand the rationale that went into decision making and not just assume that it's wrong. And I do that myself still. I also want to emphasize brilliant people are amazing. They ask why an awful lot. And I'm not used to that as a compliance officer. I would walk into a room and people hated me immediately. I was the scariest person in the company. I was the only one who could walk in and fire a doctor. It was just terrifying. So people didn't come back and ask me why a lot. And it was really important for me to learn how to check my own rationale for thinking and the recommendations I was making around privacy and security especially. And it's okay to ask why, and it's not a challenge when people ask why. They just genuinely want to understand and they want to challenge assumptions, and that's a good thing. And I think I've learned more about the rules that I used to enforce since coming to Silicon Valley and working with really brilliant people who just really don't believe that because I say so is a good enough reason. And it's been incredibly enlightening for me as well. So the other thing I wanted to emphasize today was that when we know what's expected of us, we actually save a lot of time, and we have less fear as humans. I did say happy in here earlier today, and I don't know that that was the right word. Being fearless is a beautiful state of being. When you go home at the end of the night and you really have no idea if you did the right thing, and you sit up and you can't sleep, and you think about the inbox items that you didn't cover because you weren't sure if you prioritized correctly, that's a huge amount of stress. It's a huge amount of anxiety. And what I found was that there is a culture of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around most of what's in privacy, security, and compliance's portfolio. That people really don't understand exactly what to do. It feels very contradictory sometimes. And we're taking a swag at things and going home saying, well, I guess I'll get arrested tomorrow or not. and that's a terrible state of being. It's bad for health, it's bad for morale, and it's bad for humanity in general. So I take an approach of really trying to combat fear, uncertainty, and doubt by really enhancing knowledge of what is actually intended by most of these rules. And we really examine intention because we're trying to build an ethos for ourselves as we make decisions every day. And it's important for us to understand what we need to accomplish and not necessarily all the rules for how we do that, because then we can be innovative thinkers while still accomplishing the intention of rules and the ways that we protect people. So I always start every conversation expecting it to be crucial, and there's a book called Crucial Conversations. I don't know if you've had to read it. I was offered that book by bosses 4 times, so I'm assuming I needed to read it. And what I realized is that when you talk about weighty topics like privacy and security, every conversation is crucial. People are terrified to have the conversation. You need to empathize with that and understand that these are tough conversations for the other party, that it's possibly the first time in their career that they're addressing a challenge that they're really worried about. And so we have to come to those conversations with compassion and understanding. I don't know why that keeps happening. I also try to live my life without fear. I do that by examining what's the worst case scenario for any decision I've made. I met a man when I was 19. He was awesome. And he was in the military, and that meant that in 3 months, we had to figure out if we were going to continue a relationship or not, because he was getting deployed to a foreign country. And I could only go with him if we were married. So in 3 months, I made the decision to get married. And 3 months after that, I was married. You can imagine my mom was pretty upset. And I did that without fear, because my feeling was, what's the worst case scenario here? Could I recover? What would it take to recover if that worst case scenario were really realized? And last Saturday was our 23rd anniversary, so I think I made the right choice. Aww. I know some of you are less than 23 years old, so just don't tell me about it later. I don't know. But the worst case scenario is often nothing more than, kind of a bad day, a bad week, a bad month. And then you have to look at probabilities of some of those bad things actually happening, right? So risk is actually probability times impact, not just impact, right? When we manage risks, we really have to look at what's the probability of something actually happening. So when I talk to people about healthcare and HIPAA, and they're like, oh, I'm going to go to jail for HIPAA. Do you know how many people are in jail for HIPAA? Did you know you could go to jail for HIPAA violations? Up to 10 years. Okay, 1 person. Out of 281,000 investigations by the Office for Civil Rights, guess how many sanctions there have been? I don't have any swag, but 51, or at least the last time I looked at it. So really, it's the probability and the impact. We need to understand both in order for us to really have fear in our hearts, right? It doesn't mean that we disregard. It doesn't mean that we don't take the right actions, but it does mean that we assess the probability of this actually being our greatest fear. And that relieves the pressure, the stress of living a life where these horrible things are always an impending doom. So with that, I have a few topics for op-ed, and I want to leave time for questions, and we only have like 2 minutes left. But I was watching a really great video yesterday while I was on a red eye from London, which is probably why I'm a little bit snarky today. And it was the latest AI debate, and it was between Jack Ma and Elon Musk, and it was talking about AI. It's great. Check it out on YouTube. It's a fun watch. Everything with Mr. Musk is always fun. And they were talking about what the world is going to be like in the future, and what's our future as technologists. You know, what do we need to know, and are our jobs going to go away? These sorts of things. And there was disagreement between the two brilliant people, but I believe and I agree with Jack, and partly with Elon as well, is that we as humans still have a really important role. When you go to Netflix tonight, download a documentary called AlphaGo. It's a fantastic documentary that talks about humanity and AI and the clash of those two kind of cultural things. And it talks about the importance of compassion and empathy in the development of tech. I think that people have to develop something a little bit more than binary coding skills in the go forward. That we are still going to be the ones drawing boundaries around how technology will operate. And then we have to do that with compassion and understanding of humanity. So it requires more creative juice. Jack Ma said everybody should go to art class. I don't know if I go that far, but I did start drawing just to make sure I'd have a job. And I do think that we'll play in a very, very important role. It's just, it might be a little different than what we see today. You know, 25 years ago, there were no such things as webmasters. This was a made-up term that didn't have any meaning 25, 30 years ago. And now it's a very common terminology. I think that there's new jobs that are waiting to be developed. And I think that technology ethicist and technology teacher is a really great role that will depend on really smart thinking and creative juice that all of you have the capability of providing for. So I'm going to stop. 10 minutes left for questions.
We have our mics. See you right here.
They're here.
Jutta, thank you. What an amazing overview and linking all these different areas together. Thank you so much. Very provocative. A number of issues that I know are going to raise questions. As always, we like to engage the audience, and we have 10 minutes now for specific questions that you can raise with Jutta. But again, thank you so much for this wonderful overview and tying so many areas together. So we have mics. We'll come around. Please, if you could wait, because we have colleagues in other campuses and we're recording. So please wait for your question until we get you a mic. But we'll start right now, and the floor is open.
Good. I hate a silent room. It's always like, oh gosh, I didn't tell anybody anything important. Go ahead. We'll start over here. Okay.
Hi.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of one of the clashes you talked about in the last slide about technical innovation and old ways to safeguard, what the outcome or the final decision was and the thought process to arrive at that?
Yeah, I'll give you one that I was particularly proud of. I'm sometimes proud of the work I do, and it's not just being mean. It was around data de-identification and healthcare research. So there's kind of a trend that we're moving toward with a lot of our AI and ML work that says, let's just de-identify all the data, and then there won't be any of this risk. We'll be able to get lots more data. We'll be able to get much more access to corporate repositories, these sorts of things. And in healthcare especially, it's incredibly challenging to do that. It's not a bounded problem like an AlphaGo problem, right? We don't know what rules to teach a computer about how to diagnose something like cancer. And so when we decouple identity and data, and we have to do that very aggressively to meet the requirements of HIPAA and anonymization in the EU, we decouple a lot of the useful information that may really have an impact on the algorithms that we develop. So the clash for AI was, do we use large de-identified data sets to train models when we know that we're going to be removing intimacy and accuracy at the same time? And are we going to design models that are going to be inherently less useful and less correct in our predictions because we wanted to protect people from privacy concerns that really have an almost 0% chance of happening, right? So what we did was we really just focused on becoming a company that was like any other clinical research organization. It was as though we were a hospital. Everything was segmented, separated. We didn't always attempt to get only de-identified data because it really resulted in less accurate models for predicting health outcomes. And we want to get from estimation to actual prediction for like disease progression. And so the only way we can do that is by using real data. So we kind of had to see this clash of saying, let's remove any privacy barriers by de-identifying everything, tokenizing everything, running new ML algorithms to make sure that there's no chance that there's any PHI left, to just addressing the fact that we have to be regulated for this, we have to apply the highest standard of care, that there are no shortcuts, and we should just make sure that the models are accurate. And that was one of the big clashes that we kind of overcame by just saying, we're just going to make the investment in doing this the right way so that we can make better prediction.
Thanks for the lovely talk. You mentioned that one thing to consider when you're building stuff is that the adversary only has to be right once. And you followed that up in your second last slide by saying that you shouldn't be so afraid of the risks that you never do anything. How do those two sentiments sit together, and how do humans make the trade-off?
Right, so I'm going to give you my personal opinion, no commentary on where I work or anything that's happening in the world. You have to be accepting of some degree of risk. You have to attack the problems that are going to have the highest likelihood of events, right? So there's no such thing as a secure computer unless you fill it with concrete and dump it in a pool, right? That's the old joke. So there is always going to be some degree of risk. So you have to do a really good risk assessment. You really have to look at the likelihoods. You have to look at a defense in depth strategy and whether or not there's there's an even remotely reasonable probability of something actually happening. And then you have to forgive yourself if you have a mistake and that does occur. If you've done due diligence, if you've taken all reasonable approaches and something bad happens, and it did. When I was the network ops manager at OPM, the Office for Personnel Management, we flew the Chinese flag on our USA job site for a day. Wasn't great. I had to go to the CERT, I had to take all these precautions, and honestly, the net result was they did something super smart, and we didn't do anything super dumb. And at the end of the day, you just have to take those lessons, you have to resolve to not have those same mistakes occur a second time, and then you just deal with the outcome. So it's an exercise in forgiveness, right? And recognizing that the probabilities really matter, and that you can only make an investment to some percentage, and that there is going to be gap. So you're right, the adversary only has to be right once, but we shouldn't make them use their easiest tactic in order for them to break us, right? We need them to use something that's really innovative and different and new. Is that helpful at all? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I was really intrigued at the sort of cultural piece that you mentioned about, every conversation was a crucial conversation and ending statements with a question mark. And those are both very telling for a sort of one-on-one dynamic for how you kind of build trust in the organization. I'm curious for what that looked like at scale, like in a large organization like Google or OPM or Deloitte.
Yeah.
What are some strategies to kind of scale up this cultural transformation beyond one-on-one interactions when that transformation might be philosophically like contradictory, right? Like something like security versus innovation.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
So I've spoken to ridiculously big groups of people that scare you, right? Like I talked about 600 managers and directors once for one of my health systems about this exact topic. It's this culture of change, this culture of compliance. And really it's about tying an emotional reaction to something through narrative, right? It's talking about a topic. For me, it was Medicare billing. Super sexy, super exciting, and nobody wanted to talk about it. And tying it to something that everybody can kind of become attached to. And I talked about how Medicare billing and registration of patients at a registration desk and identity proofing people and our inability to do that very accurately because we don't have a national identifier and we weren't doing great identity checks and we were just creating new records for people or we were using the wrong ones, resulted in people losing their homes, you guys. Like there's like serious impact for individual people, and drawing stories of actual people who are harmed and the frequency at which that happens resonates with people, and they can attach an emotional investment in making sure that that isn't going to happen on their watch. We had one patient who was a veteran who couldn't get his hospice benefits because he was already dead. Right? I mean, this happens. We actually have lots of duplicate Social Security numbers in the United States. It's not actually as unique as you think. And so this particular veteran was listed in our system as having already been deceased. And so he died at home alone with his family without hospice care because he was already dead. And so when you can draw these stories out, it really helps people connect, and you can do that en masse. And it doesn't have to be tragic stories. Sometimes they're beautiful stories. Somebody who was helped. And those are actually the more impactful ones. You don't sell through FUD, through fear, uncertainty, and doubt for the long term. You can get reaction in the short term through FUD, but the only way to get long-term commitment to change is through the application of positive message building. And so that's what I tend to focus on when it's something more broad.
So speaking with some friends in security and privacy, there is a concern among them that when companies are looking at probabilities and looking at cost-benefit analysis, that it seems like sometimes they make the choice to just break the privacy law and take the fine rather than investing in good cybersecurity teams. Do you think this is a problem, and what are the most impactful policy changes that you think have to happen for companies to take it more seriously?
Yeah, timely question, right? So I'm going to talk about HIPAA more than I am the GDPR, because I think from a privacy perspective, the HIPAA rules underwent revision in any kind of substantial way back in 2003, posted in 2005 with some revision on sanction amounts in 2009. So really, this is vintage law, you guys. It says you can't email people because there's no encryption on email, right? And it talks about having to have integrity checks on databases because they weren't built into databases at the time. So there's really old rules. And for HIPAA up until 2009, the maximum penalty for a violation of HIPAA was like $25,000. And then they didn't enforce it. And to this day, they haven't enforced it. They've enforced it for 50 some times. So the penalties really matter, but only if they're willing to investigate, sanction, and apply them, right? Because that deterrence effect is super critical and important. I can speak for myself and the programs I've run. I never cared about the penalties. That was never a consideration for me. I wanted to do what was right for people. And the company I work for now is very much of a like mindset. This is not a penalty that is concerning, except that it was an indication that we hadn't done all of our due diligence, and we're going to do better. We're going to earn everybody's trust again. So I don't think that the big companies are just saying screw it. I don't think that they're viewing this as a cost-benefit analysis, saying, the investment is $500 billion and the penalties are, a fraction of that. Let's just not make the investment. I saw that happen in finance back in the early 2000s. But I don't see that anymore today. I think that there is that concern out there, but I don't actually see that in industry myself. But everybody should have their opinion. You should do due diligence. You should ask those questions. You should ask those questions when you apply for jobs. I did. I asked for 4 more interviews after I got my offer because I wanted to know if they were serious, because I wasn't going to go apply my trade here if I didn't think they were serious. And so I made that effort. I wanted to know that they were going to take my guidance seriously and do what I think is the right thing to do. And they wholly convinced me that they were. And now I believe everybody. I believe everybody's great. I think everybody can do everything. So maybe I'm not the best judge, but I have experienced over the last 5 months where I am that they are absolutely serious about it. So yes, and in the past, I think I saw that a lot. In the very early days of privacy, when the costs were unbounded, there was no guidance on what you should spend, and you can certainly spend 100% of your operating revenue on this stuff, for real. So there wasn't a real good measure for what was a reasonable and appropriate investment, and so people were underinvesting. I think that we know enough now, and we know that there is a real PR blowback. There's lost customers in healthcare. 1 in 7 people who experience a data breach will switch doctors. And over their lifetime, that's equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars of potential revenue. So there's not an interest in losing those patients. And so if trust and patient privacy is important to people, and they're willing to stop doing business with you if you make mistakes, they will make more investment. So it really matters a lot that people stand up, they talk about what they want, that this isn't just something that regulators care about, that this is actually something that is a delightful feature we want you to invest in as a tech company. We as people need to evidence our interest in this topic in order for investment to rise.
And we've really come to the end of our hour.
Sorry.
And I want to thank Jutta for really those compelling issues, really making us think about it and having us all look at privacy, security, and its various applications in such a way. So we'd like to not only thank all of you for coming to CITRIS, but hope you'll join us in our other campuses we say hello to. Join us over the coming months as we have additional speakers, but this was quite compelling. So please join me in thanking Jutta one more time.